Just a few more seconds here. Good evening. Good evening, attendees. Welcome to the Economic Development Community Meeting. Our panelists will now take it away. We have a chat function down at the bottom of your screen, or maybe on the top, depending on your platform. And we also have a Q&A. So the Q&A will be interspersed throughout the discussion. If you have a question for any of the panelists, find that Q&A tab either at the top or the bottom of your window and type your question in there, and we'll get to as many as we can during those question periods. Over to you, Councillor Guy-Wade-Elliott.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. My name is Guy-Wade-Elliott, council member for Chippewas and Naywash Unceded First Nation. And I also hold the portfolio for economic development. I'd like to say on behalf of the interim board for Naywash Investments LP, welcome to tonight's session. I'd like to further thank Chief and Council for providing leadership and support during this process we are currently undertaking. To everyone participating in this virtual community engagement session, Chimigwech for joining. This presentation shared tonight will lay out a proposed framework for our nation to pursue economic reconciliation in our territory. I would like to ask that everyone keep an open mind as we navigate this new process and jot down any questions you may have and you may wish to ask along the way. There will be plenty of time to ask questions throughout each segment and at the very end. And even afterwards, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of the interim board members. Next slide, please. So during the interim board meetings, I'd like to share a bit of an analogy that's often used. So Naywash Investments will become the vehicle that helps us create wealth in our territory. It will be driven by an independent board of directors and qualified managers. Council will sit in the passenger seat and give direction to where this vehicle is headed. Our membership will also be passengers and will benefit from this experience when the vehicle arrives at various opportunities along the way. Next slide. Number 3, please. Okay, so this presentation will cover the following topics. Why economic development? So the reasons might be obvious to most, but this session will cover various examples so that we can be inspired as a community. The proposed business structure for NILP. Gary Kissick, who council retained, leads a highly respected Indigenous business practice, Fogler Rubinoff. He'll walk us through the proposed structure. Under corporate governance, we'll cover the composition of the board, roles and responsibilities, etc. Under business development strategies, this is an important topic that will require community buy-in in order to support council's decision to fund the startup of the operations. So where do we start? Well, we'll cover off some important setting of some goals and priorities, setting next steps and key dates. And then finally, the Q&A. But like I said earlier, we'll take questions throughout the various sections and answer any final questions at the very end of the presentation. Next slide. So why pursue economic development? So our community currently operates through transfer payments from both federal and provincial governments. This covers social services, health programs, public works, etc. From my experience in the past term, back in 2003, and now, there's never enough funding. If we look at our current situation, we have lack of housing, a failing infrastructure in our band-owned buildings, and the roads are in the worst shape that they've ever been. I would love to see a day where we do not have to rely on any funding from outside agencies or have to fight with government on what's important, such as having access to clean drinking water. And this is currently happening, and it's such a sad situation to see. So during this presentation, imagine a world where we do not have to rely on the government for anything. We can do this by building our own economy in our own territory. Next slide.
So before Canada and before the United States, Indigenous nations were masters in their own territory. We had philosophies, we had psychology, we had governance systems, we had food and military security, we had religious thought, political beliefs, ceremonies. We were a strong people. The last 150 years have been a struggle of survival for our people. Our way of life, which has been developed with precision over many centuries, was disrupted, not extinguished. Reconciliation is really about peaceful coexistence, restoring balance in relationships, and living together in mutual respect and harmony. Is Canada ready for reconciliation?
Like, you cannot have an independent people who rely upon money from somewhere else, and this is why we have to build economies.
We need strong, sustainable economies to get there. But what is that to Indigenous people? The NCIED build capacity for governance for nations, and we foster wise practices, learning from what has worked. But then you've still got to build entrepreneurs, your community corporations, and your nation initiative in a way that reflects who we are.
Indigenous entrepreneurs build businesses differently. And it's with a paradigm of shared value rather than an individualism paradigm.
So as Indigenous peoples, we believe that humans exist in a reciprocal relationship with the land. This connection with the land and the community provides identity, and this becomes a fertile ground to nourish culture and the seeds of opportunity for sustainable economies.
In the world of economic development, what we're trying to relay, we bring it down to 4 elements: land, legal and governance structures, opportunity drivers, business development capacity. And the base is the land which things grow from.
These layers or these levels here represent different ways of asserting, practicing, and maintaining powers of self-governance or autonomy or self-determination that's responsible to the earth and our stories, our elders, and our future generations.
I think it is a question of values. We have to live our values. We have to be who we say we are. You know, I think a lot of people do value accumulation of money. I think in their lives, the way they make decisions, the way they live, 1,000 years ago in the Haida Nation, or any in most indigenous nations, people got power from the respect of their peers. And there was nothing more powerful than in the potlatch system than giving away everything you owned. That people valued that.
Every Indigenous community, I am sure, in embracing the word economics, will have a different take on it. Economics is the management of our home. Ecology is the study of our home. And I think too often today we forget the eco part of economics. So my cry is, let's put the eco back into economics. And Indigenous people understand that very, very much. When they moved into new ecosystems, they didn't know how it all worked. They didn't suddenly magically talk about sustainability. They knocked things out like all of us would in these new areas. And then they began to learn from the lessons of their ancestors. And all of that was incorporated into the body of Indigenous knowledge, which was about how you live in this place. That is, to me, the basis of sustainability. And that knowledge is thousands and thousands of years old and will never be duplicated by science. Science will never be able to do that. The only way I believe that we have to guide us into finding a new way of living is the Indigenous communities.
Sometimes I think it's as simple as all of us just understanding who we are and being who we say we are. We're just looking for new ideas and looking at ways of going forward and building sustainable economies that reflect Indigenous cultures and reflect who this nation we're attempting to build together. That's what reconciliation's about.
So thanks very much for playing that, Beth. As Guy Whedon mentioned, my name's Gary Kissick, and I've been retained as legal counsel to Naywash to assist in the formation of the Economic Development Corporation. I'm going to be speaking at various times throughout the presentation, and as you'll see as we go through this evening's presentation, the interim boards included some case studies, some examples of some successful economic development corporations that have been formed by First Nations throughout the country. And that's what we're going to get into next. We're going to talk a little bit about Member 2 First Nation, and we'll be playing another video which talks about some of their successes. It's an interview of Chief Terry Paul. You'll see that from this slide that Member 2 First Nation, according to their most recent annual report, they do have actually a relatively small population of about 1,700 people on and off reserve. But they, in their most recently completed fiscal year, their Economic Development Corporation generated $67 million in revenue, and it now owns a little over 12 corporate entities that have different interests. And one of the most interesting things about Member 2 is a transaction that they announced late last year and they completed earlier this year. It was, and a lot of you may have read about it in the newspaper, Member 2, along with other Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia, recently acquired a 50% interest in Clearwater Seafoods, which was a $1 billion acquisition. A lot of people are holding that up as an example of what First Nations communities in Canada may be able to achieve. But I think it's probably best if we hear directly from Terry Paul. So if we could go to the next slide, Beth, and if you could please play the next video, that'd be appreciated.
Because I come here, I love my grandmother's face. This is one. This one I leave.
What motivates Chief Terry Paul is the community of Member 2, its people. its youth, its elders, its everyday citizen. There are so many proud moments of the leadership of Chief Terry Paul. I remember hearing this one story of Indian Affairs coming down in the member two, and the chief and council were proposing ideas. They wanted to build a Churchill Road. They wanted to build a member two, a rink, and they wanted to build so many other different strip plaza, mall. So the Indigenous services came down and heard their concerns and heard their requests and says, okay, we'll go back to Ottawa. A couple weeks later, they receive a letter in the mail from Indigenous Services. So they wrote down 20 statements on why those 3 projects would not work. Chief Terry Paul looked at it, threw the letter in the garbage, and he says, okay, we'll do it on our own.
Starts with a vision. When I was growing up here, there was no employment at all, and we only had one road coming in. And what we say about that is that there's no way out. Like, there was taxi drivers, the services that come from town were really afraid to come up here because of the rate of crime that was here. And there wasn't really nothing going on other than that.
I think we can serve as an example. It's taking advantage of the opportunities that come your way and then sharing your story with other communities.
What I can say, like, when I think back about how I did things, is that, besides being honest and fair with the people that you deal with, is that being really committed in what you're trying to do and really working hard in what you're trying to accomplish. And really, when it comes down to it, the way I think, is that it's not accepting no for an answer, and there's always a solution. There's always a way around that no. And we're proof of that. And we've accomplished a lot of things by not just going away after you've been told no.
So now that we've talked a little bit about, or we've watched some videos about why economic development for First Nations communities has been so important to their working towards financial independence, and hearing a little bit about the success of Member 2 First Nation. The next part of our presentation actually talks a little bit about how that actually gets done and what the proposed business structure looks like. And so this part of the presentation talks, next slide please, talks about the legal structure part of it, which is why I'm speaking to this particular issue, is that most First Nations, when they set up their economic development entities, they set them up by way of a limited partnership. And what that involves, it involves 2 entities. It involves a general partner, which is a corporation, and it involves the First Nation, which is the limited partner. Now, in this particular case, the benefits of a limited partnership are that it helps limit the legal liability for business risks associated with business activities. It also helps limit the risk of taxation of the business income that would otherwise be subject to taxation. And we try to structure these entities in such a way so that that is minimized or mitigated. It also actually helps to protect First Nations communities from potential clawbacks in relation to their own source revenues. And that's a federal government policy that's a little bit complicated, but it could probably be easily summarized by the federal government from time to time implements these policies that they limit the amount of transfer payments that they make to a First Nation if they're really successful when it comes to economic development. And so we try to minimize that through the structure of a limited partnership. One of the other things that a limited partnership does, as well as a board of a general partner that is really just responsible for managing the business activities of a First Nation, is that the intention is to try to better manage the risks of what we refer to as undue political influence over business decisions. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in some research that was done by actually what's called the Harvard Report. And the Harvard Report looked at a bunch of economic development corporations for First Nations, and they concluded that the most successful economic development corporations are those which achieve a real balance between political and business decision making. Next slide, please. The next slide is an illustration of the partnership structure, which, as you can see from the PowerPoint presentation and the diagram, there's no real change in the ownership of the economic development investments or the businesses. Is that Chippewas of Naywash First Nation will continue to own, as you'll see, 99.99% of the ownership interest in the business investments. And this new company called Naywash Investments GP Inc., this is where you'll have what's called an independent board of directors that will be recruited and will have business experience. And they only own 0.01% of the business investments, but they are responsible for managing them. And we've included here an illustration of some potential businesses that might fall under the management of Naywash Investments LP. And that's, as you can see, is potentially the property on Highway 6, potentially some medical isotopes business, and maybe some future investments that the board of directors and the management of Naywash Investments may be able to secure for the benefit of the community. Next slide, please. So, as I was saying, is that the business structure itself involves these two entities, the general partner and the limited partner, which is Chippewas of Naywash First Nations. And Chippewas of Naywash First Nation is still will be entitled to receive all of the profits and distributions from Naywash Investments and from the operating businesses or the investments that it makes. Now, the Naywash First Nation, as represented by Chief and Council, is also the sole shareholder of this new corporation that's going to be set up. And through a series of policies and bylaws that we'll actually work with the interim board of directors and chief and council to implement. One of the key things that we always want to try to ensure when we set up the economic development entity for a First Nation is that we want to ensure that that entity is consistently reporting to and remaining accountable to the elected council and the First Nation membership. And we try to facilitate a collaborative working relationship between the economic development entity and the council, not only the elected council, but the senior management at the band. And we'll try to, one of the objectives is to try to bring the necessary expertise into the board of directors of Naywash Investments to ensure that the board of directors, as I mentioned before, actually has that business experience if they're going to be responsible for supervising the business affairs of Naywash Investments. So next slide. Now, through a series of meetings, next slide, number 14, please. Yeah. Through a series of meetings that we've had probably over the last, oh my goodness, 4 to 6 months, I think, is that the interim board of directors of Naywash Investments has met with council a few times and made some recommendations. And for purposes of this community meeting, we're communicating to you today what those recommendations currently are. And as you'll discover later on in the presentation when we go through the Q&A, is that feedback from the community is being encouraged and welcome. And to the extent that you have some thoughts on the governance structure that we're going to be discussing tonight, or you think that you have some concerns, you're encouraged to please email. It'll be email Guy Waden or one of the interim board members, and we'll be taking those. We'll be working with the interim board and council to look at all those comments and concerns that you may have, and then we're going to be holding a subsequent community meeting in probably a month or two to give you feedback on how the interim board has responded to those concerns. So very quickly is that the board of directors of Naywash Investments is intended to be comprised of 5 board members. One would be a nominee director from the elected council, which would be the chief or another elected council member, and together with 4 independent directors. And what we mean by an independent director is that someone who's not an elected representative or an immediate family member of an elected council member. Now, the intention when we have a nominee director from the chief, from the elected council on the board of directors, is that the intention there is to ensure there's always this consistent communication between between Naywash Investments, the economic development entity, and the chief and council. And the intention of having that nominee director is to ensure that they're acting like a liaison, to ensure there's always that consistent flow of information. Now, when we've talked a little bit about these independent board of directors, and then, well, how are they going to be identified, and who are these independent board members going to be, is that one of the things that we talk about is you want to make sure, or our recommendation is that the independent directors that are selected to sit on the board of directors of Naywash Investments, that they have the necessary skills and experience to manage the business opportunities and risks associated with engaging in business activities and investments. Now, when it comes to selecting each of those individuals, it is important to keep in mind that the recommendation to the council has been that preference will be given to qualified candidates who are either on or off reserve members of Chippewas of Naywash First Nation. That's let's call it the first choice of board members for Naywash Investments. The second choice would be individuals who have that business experience, but who are also Indigenous. And then the third choice would be someone who's not Indigenous, but may bring some particular value to Naywash Investments. Maybe they have a particular relationship with Naywash, or maybe they're a local business person. But that'll be decided after the once the call out for directors is made, and that applications are received and reviewed. That leads into the next point, which is that the interim board intends to issue a call for applications to the Naywash community, and anyone interested and qualified for the position of position on the board of directors will be able to apply. Those candidates will be reviewed, and the interim board will make recommendations to the council for the appointment of these board members. And any candidates that are recommended for appointment are recommended by the interim board to the chief and council for appointment. They'll need to be unanimously approved by council before they are in fact appointed. Once those recommendations are made and council approves them, is that council intends to give notice to the community and give the community at least 10 days advance notice prior to the effective appointment of any successful candidate. The last point in terms of the structure for the board is that the intention is for those board members to be actually appointed for what we call staggered 3-year terms. I won't get into the staggered part of it, but the intention is that you wouldn't elect somebody every year, is that the appointment would be for 3 years, and then each director would be entitled to sit on the board of directors for a maximum of 2 consecutive terms. Next slide. This slide I'm not going to go into in a great level of detail because we'll make an abbreviated version of this PowerPoint available for all community members upon request. And this slide describes the different roles and responsibilities between the board of directors and the council. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see that the board of directors is responsible for developing effective policies on corporate governance. Their role is to oversee the management and investment decisions that are made by Naywash Investments, and that they were going to be responsible every year for preparing an annual report, or to ensure that an annual report is prepared by management that will be provided to the council as well as the Naywash membership. The elected council, on the other hand, their role and responsibility is primarily to ensure that they have the right people in place at the board of directors level. And they will have the ability to appoint and remove directors who council believes may not necessarily be acting in the best interest of the community. It doesn't, in my experience at least, and I've been doing this for probably about 15, almost 20 years now for working with First Nations communities, is that it doesn't happen all that often, but every once in a while it happens that the First Nation may select directors that maybe they, in hindsight and after some experience with them, they may not necessarily be the right people, and council will always have the ability to remove directors if they feel that they're not acting in the best interest of the community. It's also important to keep in mind that council will ultimately always determine how much of the income will actually be distributed to the council. It'll be up to council to decide how the money that we hope gets made by Naywash investments ultimately gets spent. Next slide, please. I alluded to this earlier, and I think this is my last slide before I turn it back over to Guy Whedon, is that I referred to this earlier. It's a study that's called the Harvard Project, and the Harvard Project was a study that was engaged in, sponsored by Harvard University, and it was an in-depth study of the economic development activities of Native American tribes. And what they found, as I said earlier, was that the most successful economic development corporations are those that were able to achieve a balance between having an economic development corporation that was allowed to operate, let's call it mostly independently, but without undue political influence. But at the same time, the economic development corporation always has to act in accordance with the community objectives and the goals and priority setting. That's the discussion that will take place every year between council and the board of directors, because you want to make sure that there's never any misalignment between what the economic development corporation is doing and what the community wants to see the economic development corporation doing through it. Usually we refer back to the community plan. And that's what the Harvard Project was all about. You can take a look at this in a little bit more detail if you, when you have an opportunity. And we just included it in this PowerPoint presentation for your reference. Over to you, Guy Whedon.
Thanks, Gary. So as mentioned before, a governance framework will be developed by the board of directors and presented to council for final approval. So in this framework, it'll include bylaws, policies, and procedures such as conflict of interest and codes of conduct that will promote transparency and accountability to the shareholders and ultimately the membership. In my experience, it's very important for membership, council, and our business partners to have this transparency in place. The ultimate responsibility lies with the board of directors to ensure that the framework is followed to a T. So with this document in place, we can begin to operate independently of any political pressures or influences while remaining accountable to the council and ultimately the membership. So the interim board realizes that this is a very important step, that we get this governance framework right the first time. Next slide.
My name is Solomon King, and I'm a counselor at Chippewas of Naywash, and I also sit on the active portfolio. And so what we want to do here is touch on some positive examples of success. And this case study too is 6 Nations of the Grand River. And so we have Matt Jameson as the president and CEO, and it just goes through, it's basically taking a for-profit approach with a not-for-profit governance model. So it's kind of like putting a twist on it, but being able to strategize and be able to look at it a certain way where it'll actually have a positive impact in the community. Next slide. So with this, the SNGRDC revenues and assets, their total assets are $86.8 million. And out of that, the national enterprises, the revenue is 24,512,000, give or take. And their economic interests, equity ownership revenue, is 7,850,000. And for the trust entities, their revenue is around $777,000. To attain these results, Six Nations invested on average around $24 million each year since 2013. Next slide. So this is a 5-year overview from 2015 to the end of 2019. And all these numbers are on the graph are in millions. Next slide. So this is a chart of how the community benefits from the ECDEV Corp. For example, there's a community food bank, 42,000, languages, 100,000, Woodland Cultural Center, 59,000, and Six Nations Polytechnical, 100,000. And these are just a few, but the total investment in the community was $10.8 million. Next slide. And I'll hand that over to
me, Guy Whedon. Maybe I'll ask a question of our of Michael. Is there any questions through the sections that we can maybe stop and answer?
Yes, we have some questions. Saul, you're fairly familiar with how to go through this. Do you want to grab those questions for the panel?
Saul, do you want to lead that, the Q&A?
I'll start with the first one while he's bringing that up. So a member asks, what's the purpose of providing 10 days notice to the community? And I believe this was in reference to the appointment of a director.
Yeah, I can take that. So this is a practice that's been developed by a number of First Nations communities, and the elected council with those communities, and it's been followed by Naywash, or this is the recommendation, is just to give the community notice of the directors that are intended to be appointed, and it gives community members an opportunity, should they have any concerns with the directors that are intended to be appointed, that it gives them an opportunity to contact the council or make a submission.
Okay, I'm going to take over now.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the next question is, can directors be removed?
Yeah, I should probably take some of these questions. I can see them up on the chat function. Oh. And yes, directors can be removed, and we didn't include it in this presentation, but directors will be the shareholder, which is the elected council, or it's Chippewas and Naywash First Nation as represented by council. They would be entitled to remove any director if they breach any of the corporate governance policies. And those corporate governance policies require that the directors will have to follow a code of ethics and conduct, avoid conflicts of interest that are not disclosed. And there's also this general category in the governance policies that will be implemented that will provide that if a director is not acting in the best interest of the community, that would entitle the elected council to remove that director. The next question is concerning director compensation. Director compensation, as well as senior management compensation, will have to be approved by the council, and the director compensation and management compensation will be disclosed every year in the annual audited financial statements. They may not be audited for the first year because sometimes it's an unnecessary expense, but all of that information would be disclosed. Oh, the interim. Wade, you want to just talk briefly about the who the interim directors are? We actually we referred to that at the end of the presentation. We probably should have referred to it at the beginning. Wade, I think you're on mute there.
I haven't done that in 30 days, I swear. So the interim board consists of myself, Solomon King, Nick Saunders, and Martha Pedoniquit.
And they formed a working group, and that we as legal counsel have been participating in meetings with the interim board. And the next question, it's a very interesting question actually, is that the question is, so with this model, does the interim board of directors remain as directors after their term on council? The interim board of directors are actually not eligible to sit as the first board of directors. Now I'm mostly answering that question, but after a council member ceases to be a council member, they would be eligible to apply to become a director. But the key point I think to make is that the interim board of directors apply to become a member on the first permanent board of directors, if we want to call it that. And I would expect that the interim board of directors, and we'll talk about this at the end of the presentation when we talk about sort of key dates and next steps. The intention is to issue a call out for directors in the next few weeks, and then ideally have the interim board of directors replaced with the first permanent board sometime in the next probably 3 months. Would that be fair to say is the objective? I think so.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough comment. That was the intention all along, was to sort of lay the foundation for the first board, I guess we'll call it, to sort of grab the reins and continue the work that needs to be completed.
I think that answers most of the questions, although there was a question in another chat function about funding for the Economic Development Corporation, but we are going to, I think.
Yeah, we're going into that soon, yeah.
A little bit later, yeah. All right, so I'll turn it back to you, Wade, and I think we're into the next section.
Yep, so business development strategies, next slide, please. So setting up for success. So remember my analogy earlier in the presentation about NILP being the vehicle that takes us on the journey in the territory for wealth creation. Well, that vehicle is going to need some gas in the tank in order for it to go anywhere. The gas represents capital funding that would be required to kickstart the operations for Naywash investments. So we've started working on a draft budget that anticipates future operating expenses. If this budget is approved by council, we can begin making applications to other funding sources. Results, remember, will take some time. But once everything is in place, we can start to identify investment opportunities in the territory. An example is Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. Through their Economic Development Corporation, they manage a commercial plaza that houses many small businesses, all while evaluating new business opportunities. I believe their Economic Development Corporation has been in operation for well over 20 years. I'm sure Gary could confirm that. And finally, while we might consider maximizing current assets already owned by the band, let's remember we have a vacant Hope Bay property. We can further support tourism initiatives at our campground by using our Highway 6 property to attract more visitors. And finally, we should be supporting our fishermen by assisting with marketing efforts to increase the value of the total allowable catch. Next slide. So in this case study, we're referencing the Buffalo Point First Nation. It's an example of a business which is very similar to our own campground. So this concept, I guess, was discussed back in the 1960s and opened after much deliberation amongst its members on whether or not to participate in the tourism market. If you've never been to the Lake of Woods area, it's one of the most pristine areas in North America, for known for its fishing. But next to ours, I would say that it sort of pales in comparison. Today, however, the Buffalo Point First Nations Development Corporation operates a year-round full-service resort with a marina, a golf course, conference center, in addition to their initial business, which was the campground. Next slide. So I'm not saying that we do all of this, but it's just mostly for reference sake, and showing you what could occur under the right corporate structure. But while operating in a deficit, which is likely due to seasonal nature of doing business, the Buffalo Point First Nation employs up to 60 people and generates revenue without relying on outside funding, which is important, as we've referenced throughout this presentation. Next slide.
This is over to
So
Saul.
we're going to speak about diversification. It will also be important that the NILP to diversify its portfolio, both in terms of assets and investments on and off reserve. Targeted areas for investment include infrastructure, real estate, procurement, joint ventures, etc. Also, the NILP could also help manage some of the assets currently owned by Chippewas and Naywash First Nations, which Guy Whitten was touched on a bit, which was the Cape Roker Park, the property on Highway 6, just outside of Wyerton, and also possibly with the Hope Bay. So this approach could include exploring revenue generating potential for all other properties and taking it from there and moving forward. And the federal government departments are aiming to reach an Indigenous procurement objective of 5% in 5 years. So there's a lot of room for expansion and actually getting in on some of the investments in the future. So next slide.
This is for me. Is that the next two slides talk a little bit about the case study number 4, which is the Osoyoos Indian Band in British Columbia. The Osoyoos is a very well-known community when it comes to economic development, and I'm sure that a lot of people know Chief Clarence Louie. We have a video that follows right after this, and I think the key points, the key takeaways here are that the Osoyoos Economic Development Corporation in 2017 generated just shy of $30 million in revenue. They have about 13 different types of businesses. They've been steadily investing about a little over $5 million each year since about 2013. And you'll see from the video that the Osoyoos employs 138 band members and a lot of non-band members on reserve, and they're able to direct a lot of the funding into community infrastructure projects. So Beth, if you could go to the next slide and play the video, please. There's a little video from Chief Clarence Louie.
Going to school at 8 o'clock in the morning was easy compared to having to go to work at 5 a.m. And I knew as I got older, there's no way I wanted to work in a vineyard. So ever since then, I've always worked. My mom had that old res rule, go to school, get a job, or get out. And I know that once I graduated, I either had to go to work somewhere or carry on with my education, which I did. Went to university in Regina and Lethbridge and studied the Native American Studies program because that's what I was interested in. Why are Native people so messed up in Canada and the US, two of the richest countries in the world? Why are the first peoples at the bottom of the scale, every economic and social scale there is? It was good that we had a vineyard. I don't know any other band that can say they had a band business in 1968. Although a lot of these businesses came under when I was chief, it's always been a team effort. It's always been a group of people to decide how things are done. But a chief on a reserve is not a dictator. So the chief doesn't control council. Council controls council. And who controls who gets in council is the band members. The Serious Indian Band has Inkimi Cellars, which won Canada's Best Winery of the Year in 2016. That's a joint venture with Jackson Triggs. We also have a golf course, a full 18-hole championship course. We have a cement company. We have BC's biggest recreation vehicle campground in Osuyus. We have a cultural center. We have a preschool daycare. We have a grade school on the reserve. We have 2 gas stations and stores, which we own 100%. And we have various residential, commercial, and industrial lease developments on the reserve. We have Spirit Ridge on our reserve, which is a high-end hotel condo development. And we have a racetrack, which is a really unique project with a group of business people in BC. There's probably 1,000 non-natives that come to work on the reserve every day, and we have more jobs than we do band members, which is an awesome position to be in. Our focus is to develop our own people and to have our own people in senior positions. So that means we're going to spend more time. Our bus is going to go slower because it's an Indian bus. It's not a corporate bus. We've accomplished a few things. We still have a lot to do. One of the things I'm most proud of the Serious Indian Band is most of my people work. They want to work for a living. They want decent paying jobs, and they're good workers, hard workers. And with those jobs and lease revenues and taxation revenues that we now have, we're able to afford nice things that this band never had before, like a gymnasium and youth activities, a youth center.
Okay, joint ventures. So joint ventures are business arrangements where 2 or more parties decide to engage in the risk and rewards of a business venture. Each party would contribute capital, resources, and expertise. We see this as a growing trend across all industries in Canada. In most instances, First Nation will own 51% of the joint venture to ensure proper oversight, and the partner owning 49% usually takes on the responsibility of the day-to-day operations. By using this method of engaging, we could partner with a commercial developer to finally build on the Hope Bay property, as an example, or develop partnerships with businesses who are trying to gain contracts at Bruce Power under the Indigenous procurement policies, or focus on a large-scale project with companies we already know, like a Hydro One or TC Energy, as an example. Next slide. So here we have case studies that highlight some joint ventures across Canada. I'll just touch on a few of them. Peguis First Nation, they have a joint venture with Growforce Holdings to expand on operations in the cannabis industry. Fort McKay First Nation, there are numerous JVs and private sector entities in the oil sands industry. And the English River First Nation have a whole consortium of different business entities and seem to be doing quite well. Next slide. So where do we start? Next slide, please. So as I stated earlier, one of our goals could be to generate significant revenues to help achieve a greater degree of financial independence from government sources. Some of the profits could be used to support and enhance our infrastructure and fund community initiatives, similar to what the Coldwater Trust is doing. But more than that, the revenues could be reinvested to create additional opportunities. We feel that the input provided by the community has been vital to the success of where we are today. If you recall that back in 2018, a survey was held and touched on a number of concerns. Those being, employment and training, culture and language, education and apprenticeships, and finally some economic development. The following year, in 2019, a few sessions were held at the community center to engage on moving a plan forward. So what we have today is part of that plan. The continuation is important as we move forward. Next slide. So we've, as was stated earlier in the presentation, we've started developing a draft budget for the operations of NILP. We'll ask that the first board of directors finalize this document and submit it to council for approval. Our interim board has recently been discussing options for funding sources, which may include council using own source revenues, combined with maybe an application to the Coal Water Trust. Another option could be borrowing, as money is very cheap right now, or redirecting existing revenue streams which are generated and parked in Naywash accounts, generating low interest rate. And finally, specific to a particular project, maybe we could convince a proponent to help contribute towards the startup cost for Naywash investments. Just want you to please keep in mind that this is still a startup phase, and it will require adequate capital to ensure that we hire the very best and qualified people. I feel that this is a very important step to ensuring that Naywash investments will be successful. Next slide.
For current status, the interim board is comprised of what we talked about earlier was Guy Wade and Elliott, myself, Solomon King, Martha Padonaquit, and Nick Saunders. And we're working together with council to develop a governance framework and select the permanent board of directors. So right now, we're in the interim board, and we're going to move it to the next step, which is getting a permanent board of directors in place. We've worked on the terms of reference, and they've been drafted to outline the proposed business structure and governance framework for NILP. And this interim board will take it into account any feedback received during and following this meeting from the Chippewas and Naywash First Nation members in finalizing the governance framework. Next slide.
So the next steps are proposed to include issuing a call out for the first board of directors. In that call out, it'll also list out, what the desired qualifications are, and keeping in mind that the intention is to have a diverse sort of skill set on the board of directors. So it's not just going to be one, one set list that people have to identify. The board benefits from diverse skill sets and range of views. We're also going to be working with the interim board and the council to develop a process for identifying a potential general manager for Naywash investments. That still has to be determined how that's going to get rolled out, and council will be working on that with the interim board. There's also finalizing a management agreement, which is what the management agreement does is it really just identifies what the different roles and responsibilities are of the band versus that of the Economic Development Corporation. And to sort of briefly describe it, is that the intention is for Naywash Investments to focus on for-profit activities, right? And that for the government of Naywash to focus on government-related activities, which are not necessarily for-profit, but they can be. But by and large, the for-profit activities would fall under Naywash Investments, and economic development is one that sometimes crosses over into both sort of band level responsibilities and economic development responsibilities. And where it commonly plays out, or how it commonly plays out, is that the bulk of the employment training opportunities would continue to be handled by the economic development officer at the band, whereas the economic development opportunities and the employment training opportunities associated with, and those that relate to business investments, those would be led by the Economic Development Corporation. So there still would be a role for some economic development at the band level. And the final issue in terms of next steps would be to finalize the budget that Guy Whedon had mentioned still would need to be reviewed by council, and including making a determination as to where the anticipated operating expenses and the capital for investment will come from. When a lot of these issues are flushed out, after taking into account the feedback from this meeting and any comments that people may have following this meeting, then when the final recommendations are made, a subsequent community meeting will be held to give you additional feedback on where matters have ended up. On the next slide, please, is that what I just said is actually just reflected on this slide, which is the intention really is for those activities to take place over the course of the next 3 months or so. And yes, we welcome additional feedback. And Guy Whedon, I'm going to turn it back to you. Sorry, Guy Whedon, you're on mute.
Oh, damn it, I did it again. So on behalf of the the interim board, we'd like to welcome any questions or feedback that you may have on what was presented here this evening. Next slide.
I think there's about 4 open questions that Michael had highlighted. Do you want to touch on? Do you want to run through those, Guy Whedon? I think they're mostly questions to answer that are best answered by a council member. Maybe you and Saul.
I could answer the first one. So the first question is has there been an amount set aside or working capital? So at the moment, nothing has been set aside. What we're doing is we're going through the motions. We're still moving forward with developing the Economic Development Corporation. But right now we're at the point of now we got to start looking at what kind of money we can access through our different pots of money. And we have to have that discussion at the table of, are we going to move forward with this and take it from there? So right at the moment, it's still in the discussion stage. Thanks.
I think I just saw the questions here. Next one, I'll read it. Saul, is how does the board plan to ensure that Indigenous knowledge systems and values are effectively incorporated throughout the operations and decision-making process? Excellent question. I think that from my experience, this is an issue that comes up from time to time. Especially when First Nations are sort of linked at the hip with a company that might be engaged in some type of activity that the band might not support on a socially responsible level. I think that there certainly could be mechanisms in place that if something's controversial, that it's shared with the council, and if it crosses a certain value system, then it wouldn't be pursued. Does that make sense, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the next one was maybe answered a little bit by Gary earlier. Did you answer that one already?
I think so.
Okay. I'll just, next one, will the band be consulted on Hope Bay? Most certainly, yes, because it, it was such a controversial property for many years, sitting dormant, I guess. But in terms of what to do with Hope Bay, that was always in the cards. I think it's a bit troubling that nothing has been done with Hope Bay, and I think having Naywash investments in place and out there looking at what those opportunities could look like and present back to the community for consultation will certainly happen, in my opinion.
Now, I just wanted to add a little bit to the idea of the Hope Bay, and because it has come to the table a couple of times, and we've had some discussions about Hope Bay, but we've never really had any real direction with it because there's like so many different angles that you could take it from, and it ends up becoming a really becomes complicated, and we want to make sure that we have some clear direction on Hope Bay before we even decide on moving in that direction. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to start moving forward with the ECDEV, because we could actually have that experience and that those qualifications and skills in place that could help us move forward with that.
So the next question is, it was mentioned that the Wyerton property may be included under corporate shell. Is there a business plan and RA or ROI or return on investment for Wyerton property? Was community consulted on this investment? So the difference between the current Hope Bay property, there's a bit of history behind this one, in that there was significant work done over the years at the joint council level to find a suitable alternative location to the environment office, which is located at Naywash. And there was a restructuring committee that had looked at this issue over the years, and due to reasons that I'm not aware of, it was never dealt with. So the restructure committee had met again in 2019 and formulated a plan to purchase a property at a neutral site between both Naywash and Saugeen. Joint resolution was passed, giving myself the opportunity to engage with a real estate agent and make the purchase. At the 11th hour, our sister community had not fallen through with our agreement, and Naywash Council had decided to proceed with the purchase. And the plan all along was to offset the operation and maintenance and mortgage on the property with proponent funding, which we secured and managed to do. So there's a little bit of work required in order to bring it up to a standard for an office setting, but I understand that it should be completed in the next month, and the Sanio will become the first tenants of that property.
So the next question is, does this ECDEV venture compete with existing and fledgling businesses or entrepreneurs that are 100% member owned? For example, Makwa Construction. Well, my take on this is it would actually enhance it. It would actually help them along, because with joint ventures and construction and being a part of all these processes, where we partner with outside businesses and all these sort of things, is we actually get in on the ground level, and we can actually start pushing to to get our members employed, to get them involved with all this, with all these potential revenue sources. And from my point of view, that's kind of exactly where I'm coming from. But I know Giwit, and you have a little more insight on that.
Yeah, so on a larger scale, you're right. That I think that there's enough opportunity to go around without having to compete in certain interests. And it hasn't been said as to what types of joint ventures the Naywash Investments would look into. But my understanding is that without a vehicle to engage with business, then the opportunities just pass. And good on Muckwa. I read that they used Muckwa as an example. Good on them to take those opportunities and run with them. So I think those types of businesses will be supported going forward.
Yeah, that's if I could just add a quick comment, is that it's a question that often comes up in these community presentations. And I can just tell you from my experience, at least, is that over the course of the last, say, 15 years or so, this is the kind of stuff that gets us out of bed in the morning, is that we love to go to bat for First Nations band-owned and member-owned businesses when it comes to leveraging the community's rights into economic opportunities for both of those types of businesses. And I think Giwei is exactly right, is that when you have a vehicle that has the, let's call it the authority to negotiate on behalf of community members for their benefit, like it's how a lot of community and member-owned businesses, in my experience, have really been able to achieve some opportunities that they might otherwise just not be able to get their foot in the door on. That's our experience, at least.
So the next question is, there was direction provided in regards to Hope Bay. It just needs to be found. Well, I've been in council since 2018, and like I said, there was some conversations, but I'm not sure if there was actually any direction given for Hope Bay. I don't know. Do you know anything about that, Giwiden?
No, as far as I know, that I think there was a community consultation meeting held a few years back, but I was down there today earlier on my sled, and it's just such a beautiful spot, waiting to I guess to be developed again, or something needs to happen there. But we have to have a proper plan in place and proper funding arrangements and do it right. So I'll read the next one. Will there be taxes paid on investments? Is there any thought of common use for harvesting, medicine, food, wood, brush, outings for the people? Well, Gary, I'll let you address the taxes on investments, I guess.
Yeah, we've been pretty successful in structuring investments and business income to be exempt from taxation, whether they're carried on or off reserve. There are some nuances associated with that, like income on income, for example, is sometimes hard to exempt from taxation. But by and large, is that income from Naywash earned by Naywash investments should be exempt from tax.
Okay. The next question here is, what is the difference between governance and self-government? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he's referring to the governance framework. Not sure if you can type a clarifying question if you're still on the line there. So maybe we'll come back to that one.
Just-
You want to read the next one?
Okay, so the next one is what key indicators would Naywash Investments look for to define a successful first year of operation?
Well, that's a good question. I might rely on Gary for this because he's been through the rodeo a few times.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. I think that my own view would be operating within budget in your first year of operation, and that budget's going to be the revenue side of the budget is going to be very much dependent upon whether any revenue producing businesses or assets are fall under the management of Naywash Investments. And Guy Wayden had referred to this earlier. It's really important, in my view, to keep in mind that it takes time to build these economic development corporations. Member two, in one of the slides, Member two's expenses exceeded their revenue by about $800,000 or $900,000 in the first year of operation, and they were able to gradually bring that down to be break even and then to be able to make money. And you see how well they've done. They just participated in $1 billion acquisition, but it takes time. It's a private equity type of investment, or it's a startup operation, and so you should expect that the expenses will exceed revenues for the first few years, unless you get quite fortunate in executing on, for example, the joint venture strategy that Guy Wayden had laid out. Joint ventures can generate revenue with very little expense associated with it. And so that's one of the things that the board of directors would be responsible for, is how can we generate revenue fairly quickly with limited amount of expense to get there, in order for us to get to a break-even scenario within the first 2 or 3 years. To me, that would be, in my experience at least, that would be viewed as a success. Get to break-even within the shortest time frame that you can. Not likely the first year, but within a couple or 3 years would be my view.
I think we've got a follow-up one. So it appears that this is being set up as our reserve income source. Is this an avenue to self-government? Oh, okay. Yeah. So Gary, you and I had this conversation, several times in early stages, and I guess put things in perspective. Let's just say, for example, our annual budget for carrying on business on reserve. So the band's budget, let's say it's $30 million. What would it take for us to replace that $30 million if we wanted to say, we don't need your government funding anymore? Yeah. So maybe walk through that scenario, what it would take to get there, and what that number would ultimately be.
Yeah, I'll do some back of the envelope sort of math on that, but at the higher level, trying to answer the question at a higher level, is that we've been working with Indigenous communities for a lot of years now, and commonly one of the objectives is to set a long-term objective of trying to achieve as much financial independence as you can, and to be less reliant on government transfer payments. Now, it's not to say that there isn't a treaty obligation that the government has, but with politics and governments, sort of doing what they do, including trying to indirectly tax First Nations communities and your business income, and it's offensive, but it happens all the time, is that governments are always looking for a way to, not fulfill basically their treaty obligations, download the responsibility for delivering services to First Nations communities, and give them a budget and make a case out of it that says that, we're transferring all of this money, but yet, they're not providing the services. They're giving First Nations the responsibility for delivering the services and giving you part of the budget to do it. But they frame it in such a way that it always makes you worry that without achieving a degree of financial independence, you might be too reliant on, the federal government to transfer these monies. Maybe it's here today. It may not be. It may not be as. It won't keep up with inflation, and it won't keep up with your expenses, especially if you have a growing community, over the course of 20 years. So, there's usually a long-term objective to create your own source of revenue, either to supplement community expenses or to replace them if those transfer payments ever go away, or that they're carved back. But getting to $30 million is in revenue of generating your own revenue. You can see that it's taken a Soyuz and Member 2 a long time to get to that point. They've gotten to that point in the course of about 15 or 20 years. But to have assets, and I'm going to use really round numbers, but if you had your own investment portfolio, right, and you were making 10% a year on your investments, that would be great. I'd like to trade places with you if you're making 10% a year. Like, that's a great number if you're getting 10% return. But that means that you'd have to have at least sort of $300 million invested to generate $30 million of revenue. What's a more realistic number is that, to be conservative, is that if you're able to generate a 5% return on your investments every year, that's pretty good. And over time, that is shown to be very achievable if you have conservative, sort of responsible investing. But that means that Naywash would want to achieve investments of $600 million, have like assets, community wealth of about $600 million. And that doesn't happen overnight. But that's what gets you to $30 million, right? But keep in mind that $30 million today is not $30 million in 20 years from now. So these numbers sound enormous, and they sound like they're not achievable. But with the right strategy, is that we've personally witnessed and been privileged to play some role in helping some First Nations communities go from one community, zero in assets 8 years ago, to now, if you had to value their assets, they'd probably be at about $300 or $400 million. It's possible, but it takes a very focused strategy, and it takes a sort of taking the long-term view to build a community wealth. It's not easy, but I personally look at what Naywash, the opportunities that your community has. It's very exciting. I don't know a lot of communities that have as many potential opportunities in front of them the way Naywash does. So, Giwayden, I hope that was helpful.
No, I think it was. Thank you for sharing. So we have another question. What is the proposed budget that membership is being asked to approve? So I guess this is in reference to the draft budget for the operations of Naywash Investments, which will go to council for some guidance and feedback. But we don't have a solid number on that. We've sort of taken Gary's guidance on what has worked in other communities before, and it was a fairly significant number. And we've worked to sort of shred that a bit and have that figure come down. So we don't have a concrete answer to provide, but it's currently a work in progress.
So the next question is, what things would we invest in? Would like to buy Bitcoins as an investment like Bezo just did. Would that be in line? First of all, I don't know anything about Bezo, or I know very little about Bitcoin. So I can't even answer that question.
I heard an interesting thing today about Bitcoin is that the process to mine Bitcoin, like an actual an actual transaction, and Gary, maybe you can confirm this, takes so much power. It's the same amount of power that's used by the country of Argentina, is what I was told today.
It's crazy.
Like it's an enormous amount of power just to mine that one transaction.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually, is that I'm actually working on a Bitcoin mining opportunity right now for a First Nation, right? And that, like, so investing in Bitcoin itself is probably not a good type of investment, unless it represented a tiny portion, the highly speculative portion of your investment portfolio. But my experience is that the opportunities that are really worthwhile pursuing are the really boring, predictable, sustainable, cash flow generating investments like transmission lines, right? Like those assets don't trade very often. Like people don't put them up for sale very often because institutional investors like to keep them. Now they don't return as much as they used to because interest rates are so low. But power generation projects, the right types of power generation projects like Lower Matagami up north and Moose Cree, that deal, that's a $1.3 billion series of hydro dams on the Lower Matagami. They own, I think it's 25, might be 33% equity interest. And, I think it's 9.75% return on equity investment for them. And so it's those types of equity returns in that sort of 8, 9, 10%. If you can use your indigenous rights to get involved in those sorts of projects where you put your capital in late in the game, you structure it the right way, those are the types of investments that you often want to pursue, like those boring, predictable ones. Those are the ones that you can borrow money for. And if you can put in just a little bit of your own money and responsibly borrow the rest of the money to make the investment, that's where you can really generate significant returns and generate, wealth in an accelerated basis. And that's how the Mi'kmaq acquired Clearwater Seafoods. They borrowed $250 million, I think, from the First Nations Finance Authority on the strength of their other own source revenues. So it's one of the reasons why own source revenues are important, because then you can borrow against those revenues. As I say, responsibly borrow against those revenues to make further investments.
Okay. So got another question here. What consideration has been given to external risks? How does Naywash Investments propose to navigate political turnover? Another excellent question. So we had touched on this earlier in the presentation. And I think maybe what's being asked is, the political turnover, that you see between, that happens every 2 years, maybe. And I think the purpose of setting this up is so we don't have any political turnover that's going to affect Naywash Investments, right? And it's so important to make sure that those roles and responsibilities for the board of directors and also council respect what those roles are. And one of the interesting things I remember discussing this the creation of Naywash Investments early on with council. Everybody had their idea about what it is that we should be doing, and I had to sort of speak up and say, well, this is the whole point of this, is that everybody has an idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean it makes good business sense. So let's remove that those decision-making abilities for what makes good business sense and place them with a board of directors that is responsible ultimately to the membership by way of chief and council. So hopefully that answered the question there.
So another question is, our membership going to vote on any of this, or is it all approved by chief and council? So right now it's still in the development stage. We still don't have a confirmed budget, and the process is still being developed as we go along. So until council meets and we actually hash out a lot of this, then we'll have some direction from there. Is there anything you want to add to that, Giweden?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this comes up a few times, I would say, just in some conversations. But I guess before I answer, maybe I'll ask Gary: has there any community ever gone to a referendum to set up, an economic development corporation to look at creating wealth for their community? I mean, it's I don't think it's as controversial as surrendering land or voting on something that has dire implications, I guess, for future generations. My understanding of what we've been doing for the last 20 years at Naywash isn't participating in the economy around us, and it shows. So we're going to try something different with through the examples that we shared, the places that I visited.
Referendum.
We could be the last ones to sort of the economic development party, right? So I don't know, Gary, do you want to touch on any of that?
Yeah, the way this commonly rolls out is, in my experience, has been the way it's rolled out with Chippewas and Naywash is that it usually starts off with a community survey, which I think you did in 2018.
Yeah.
Council, determined that there was a level of support for setting up an economic development corporation.
Yeah.
You did a follow-up survey in 2019. Now steps have been taken to put sort of the meat on the bones, right, through the terms of reference and the governance framework, and holding a community meeting like this to get community feedback to see what sort of level of support there is, and whether the interim board and the council is on the right track in terms of how they envision the structure. And that's usually how it rolls, the Economic Development Corporation rolls out, but it's not typically put to like a referendum or a vote, because that groundwork is usually already done.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question. What actions will we undertake to ensure that over the years to come, we have a financially educated membership to fill the board and make strong decisions in the future? So this is an interesting point. I mean, I guess based on the question, there's an assumption that we don't have those people, but we really won't know until we do a call out. I'm aware of several members that live not even in this country that have a skill set, and a strong understanding of finance and real estate, for example. We do have members that touch various sectors, right? That don't necessarily live directly in the community of Naywash. So I think having an interest in the next generation is certainly something we would encourage. And if we have this corporation in place, maybe it's something that they can strive to and enroll in commerce or business related programs. So it's a good question.
So the last question I see here is, how does this benefit to members who live outside of the community, with membership at nearly 2,100 members living outside of the community? So that's a really good question, because right now we are reaching out to the membership that lives off reserve, and council's direction is also to figure out how we can actually get those members to be more active. And it's a building process though, because we don't have a lot of information for a lot of the membership. And that's what Gideon was talking about a little bit earlier, is how we have to start reaching out a bit more. We have to start like spending a little more time and resources on getting those community members to start being involved in the community. So, but in the long term, the benefits is basically we want to get them involved. We want to tell them that, you know, this is what we're planning on doing, and you know they're welcome to come in and participate whenever they can and how they can.
You know, if off-reserve community members actually own businesses as well, generally speaking, the Economic Development Corporation can assist on or off-reserve members equally, right? That's also a way.
Oh, we have our first, or we have another investor type question. Would the mic, I don't know if that's Micmac, allow us to purchase a part of their Clearwater Corporation?
Probably not.
Probably not.
But I got to tell you, like there's governments also are broke, you know, and they're getting more broke during, you know, as a result of COVID, and it's a tragedy, of course. But you know, my belief is that government will be willing, crown corporations, you know, there may be more of a willingness for them to part with some equity interests in some of their assets, because government has to raise money. You know, we saw that with the IPO of Hydro One. That was one thing, right? And that's one of the things that economic development corporations commonly do quite well. Like they, when you've got some business people around the table, working productively with usually the lands and resources and the consultation and accommodation representatives from the band, that's a really powerful combination when it comes to negotiating economic opportunities in good investment projects. Like, you know, Clearwater Seafoods that's an interesting opportunity. Yeah, sure, it's seafood, it's an operating business, it's very unusual, but those licenses for lobster, lobster fishery, is that managed well, that's a sustainable asset that should go on for, you know,
forever.
100, yeah, forever, right? Like if they're managed well, those are really interesting sort of assets, and those are the kind of things that you want to try to pursue, which is, you know, what are those types of investments that have long-term potential, right? Long-term value.
Well, off the top of my head, I mean, we do have our own fishery here. It's at a much smaller scale, but it still is a sustainable and renewable resource, right? That we're actively managing well and have been. So I think it's just providing that assistance to the fishermen, right? Adding more value to the product. So instead of, you know, fish being valued at $1 a pound or less, that maybe it's $7-8 a pound overall. You know, that increases the value of the fishery substantially. So you know, plus we have a fairly new operation at the campground in our maple syrup operation, which is doing well, and they're expanding. And you know, speaking with one of the workers today, and actually asked him to join the video today because he had some ideas and has an understanding about economic development. But so there's lots of opportunities there for us, which a lot of people will coin as low-hanging fruit. But it's just having that vehicle in place, having the people there to make some decisions, to sign some agreements, to help generate some revenue, and then build upon that, I think is what we're trying to achieve in a nutshell. Well, I think we went a little. I think we went a little over. Are there any more questions, Michael?
There's nothing outstanding.
Okay. Well, it was, I think it was very informative and lots of great questions that were asked. I want to thank everyone for joining, and look forward to our next session.
Thanks. It was a real privilege for us to participate. We thank you for that opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
So with that, I guess we'll close out the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, everyone on the back end, Beth, for all the hard work and making sure Gary was stayed on time and stayed focused.
She's the boss.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Be well. Stay safe.
Here.